Magandang umaga. And so today we will be starting with
Magandang
our
umaga po.
discussion on the structures of globalization. So this will be our second online Blackboard Collaborate discussion for our during the ECQ or the Enhanced Community Quarantine. Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. We're already 15 in our session today. So good morning, Aaron, Carlo, Adrian, Darren, Ichio, Jude, Kimberly, Lorenzo, Malcolm, Mary, Jasmine, Ryan, Benj, and Bon Emerson. Magandang umaga. And so this morning, our discussions will be concentrating on the structures of globalization. Okay, so part of our learning objectives today are the following. Medyo ang dami nito. Tulungan nyo nga akong pakibasa itong first 6 na learning objectives po natin. Sino pong gusto? Pakitaas po ang kamay. Kindly click the raise your hand button doon po sa may ilalim. Yes, Lorenzo, let's read the 6 learning objectives. Go ahead.
Sixth, yung pang sixth.
Lahat po, 6.
Number 1, define economic globalization. Number 2, identify the factors that facilitate economic globalization. Define the modern world system. Articulate the stance on global economic integration. Explain the role of financial institutions in the creation of a global economy. And narrate a short history of the global market integration in the 20th century.
Sige Lorenzo, since mukhang active na active ka ngayon, pakibasa na rin yung mula 7 hanggang 13.
Identify the attributes of global corporations. Explain the effects of globalization on governments. Identify the institutions that govern international relations. Differentiate internationalism from globalism. Identify the roles and functions of the United Nations. Identify the challenges of global governments in the 21st century, and explain the relevance of the state in globalization.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. Thank you for reading the learning objective. And so today we will start off with our discussion on economic globalization. When you talk about the concept of globalization, what we have to understand is that these are actually inclusive of 3 dimensions. The first one is what we call economic globalization. The second one is what we call as political globalization, and the other one is what we call as cultural globalization. Okay, so at this time we will be concentrating first in our discussion on economic globalization. According to the International Monetary Fund, they defined economic globalization as a historical process, meaning when you say that economic globalization is a historical process, meaning it has gone through different processes in history. Okay, kung baga hindi lang ito isang beses na nangyari, kung hindi po ito has undergone several procedures at least in history, it represented the result of human innovation and technological processes, okay, or progress. Now, definitely when you talk about economic globalization, it is a product of human innovation. When you talk about technology, when you talk about the global market, when you talk about production, okay, and all of that. So this is how the International Monetary Fund at least, okay, defined what economic globalization is actually all about. So again, when you talk about the concept of economic globalization, you have to understand that somehow we have to look at history and look at colonization as the starting point of globalization and economic globalization, because again, during this time we will actually introduce to different cultures, religions of all kinds, but not only that, even our ideas and our ways of consumption somehow altered because of the exchanges of products and whatnot. Okay, so that is actually something that we have to consider. And so, because of this, you have to understand that globalization, as multifaceted as it could be, is always hinged in the different aspects of human activities. And perhaps it is always proper to it from the perspective of a global economy. And that is how at least the International Monetary Fund gave us an idea of what economic globalization is. is somehow referring to the increasing integration of economies. And when we talk about the increasing integration of economies, meaning it becomes one when you talk about the global market, meaning it's not just a matter of an economic market of one particular state or isang bansa lamang, but this is an integration of economies around the world. Particularly, you talk about the movement of the goods and services and capitals across borders. So, meaning, when you speak of economic globalization, this is referring more on the movement of people. And when I speak of the movement of people, we talk about the movement of labor, quote unquote, and also the movement of knowledge. And when we talk about the movement of knowledge, we are referring to the movement of technology across international borders. Okay, so I hope that's very much clear to all of us. And also, this is characterized by the increasing integration of economies around the world. Okay, so we talk about the movement of goods, the movement of services, and capital across borders. But to say the least, we have to understand first, how do we define increasing integration? And when we talk about the increasing integration, we first look at the data compiled by the International Monetary Fund, where we see the value of goods and services in trade as a percentage of the GDP, or the gross domestic product. And what you see on your screen right now are data. Okay, we don't have to understand everything. What we just have to look at here is that there was what? An increased trade. Okay, which means if there is an increased trade, definitely there is also a movement of the investment. Okay, not only in a particular location, but the movement is all over the world at a faster speed. So you talk about direct investment. Okay, you talk about foreign direct investment, the export and the importing of all sorts. Now, aside from increased speed and frequency of trading, okay, items being sold and traded are also changing drastically. Okay, that's the reason why you have online shopping at the moment. So you have eBay, you have Alibaba in the Philippines, you have Lazada, you have Shopee and whatnot. And also, you talk about the books and music albums nowadays, which can be digitally downloaded. At least in the Philippines, it can still be digitally illegally downloaded. Okay, because ulitin natin, when you talk about our country, our laws, when you talk about yung pagda-download and whatnot, ay walang pangil. Okay? But I figured out somehow na when you talk about movies, wala na tayong masyadong makitang downloadable Filipino movies at this time. I think yung OMB, yung Office of Media Board something, somehow no medyo naging anong tawag dito, sila po ay medyo naghigpit pagdating sa may downloading ng mga film movies online. However, pagdating sa downloading ng mga pelikula online, Hollywood movies and whatnot, marami pa rin. And although how we consume movies at this time, especially in the times of quarantine, di ba? So most of us are actually hooked into Netflix. Ang dami na nating mga napanood. These are consumption. You talk about economic integration. On my part, ang dami ko nang napanood since the start of the quarantine. Okay, natapos ko yung Kingdom seasons 1 and 2. Sorry po, I'm not sure kung nakaka-relate kayo sa akin. Okay, and also I have done watching Itaewon Class. Diyos ko Lord, kawawa naman po ako. Okay, and also, pwede ho kayong mag-chat dito sa akin sa may chat box natin. Ano, mga natapos nyo ng mga palabas sa may Netflix. Ano po ba yung mga natapos ko? Sorry po. Natapos ko na rin yung, ay hindi ko pa natatapos yung Hi Bye Ma. Ayun yung ginagawa ko sa kasalukuyan. Okay. Maganda ba yung Lucifer? I haven't started watching it. Okay. So, perhaps I will. Tsaka yung Money Heist. Okay. So, tatry kong panoorin yung mga yan. So, let's start to look at it from this perspective, people. Let's talk about the international trading system. So, kailan ba nag-start yung tinatawag nating economic globalization? Lorenzo, yes, you're raising your hand. You want to say something? Go ahead. Yes, Lorenzo?
Can be, kanina po yan. Sorry.
Yung kanina yan. Sorry. Okay. Again, when we talk about the the advent of international trading system or the economic globalization, this, according to Flynn and Giraldes, can be traced back in 1571. So when we talk about 1571, this was during the period of colonization. At least in the Philippines, we talk about the galleon trade between Manila, okay, in the Philippines, and Acapulco in Mexico. So you talk about the Spanish colonization in the Philippines. And this was the first time that the Americas were directly connected to the Asian trading routes. But of course, you have to consider that the Filipinos had no benefit during the galleon trade here because sila po ay tagagawa lang ng galleon, but definitely we're not benefiting from anything out of the galleon trade between Manila and Acapulco in Mexico during this time. And so today, the global financial crisis will take decades to be resolved, and in particular during the time of COVID-19. Okay, in a couple of weeks or more, definitely magkakaroon tayo ng global financial crisis, which is not to be blamed on anyone because this is an enemy that we do not see, and perhaps we still do not know everything about it. Okay, and the world is somehow trying to resolve a problem which is going to be felt economically, okay, sa lipunan natin and in the whole world. So you talk about economic globalization. So when there's a global pandemic as such, so definitely our economy will be affected by it. Okay? So alternative solutions posited by some nationalist and leftist groups, they are actually giving us impractical solutions. However, when we talk about exports, okay, and when we talk about export, anong ibig sabihin nito? Okay, ito yung mga goods and services that we are exporting from our country to another. Okay, kapag goods and services naman from another country na idadala sa atin, so you talk about import. Okay, so exports, not just the local transactions of goods and services, are what make national economic growth and when economies grow. And in the Philippines, when we talk about exports, you talk about yung usually agricultural exports ang meron tayo dito, but the exports that we do have primarily is labor. Okay, yun yung karaniwang expert nating mga Pilipino. Now, the situation by then is that the advanced nations benefit most from free trade. So when you talk about economic globalization, it feels like that the world countries are mostly benefiting from economic globalization. However, with the current system at the moment, we talk about developing countries because we're not using the term third world countries anymore. Okay, so instead of using the term developing country, third world countries, we instead uh, are using right now the term developing countries. And for now, the scenario is that developing countries like, say, the Philippines or India or Argentina or Brazil, I will not be including China on count, okay? It actually accounts for 51% of global export. And this was due to the reduction of trade barriers led by the WTO or the World Trade Organization, and they consider this to be the trade liberalization. Now, in recent decades, economic globalization has ushered in an unprecedented spike in global growth rate. But when we talk about globalization, okay, our question in the discussion board was what? Ano nga yung question natin sa may discussion board natin about globalization? Is our economy benefiting from globalization or not? At nabasa ko yung mga sagot ninyo. So I would be asking you first doon sa mga sagot ninyo. Are we at an advantage or a disadvantage when you talk about globalization for that matter or economic globalization for that matter? Mary Jasmine, ano yung sagot mo doon? Ba ay nagbe-benefit o hindi? Hi, Mary Jasmine. Doon sa may discussion board. Okay. More on advantage. Bakit more on advantage, Mary Jasmine? Can you use your microphone? Hindi gumagana yung microphone ni Mary Jasmine. Myrene Labrador, ano yung sagot mo sa may discussion board natin, ma'am? Okay. Hi, Myrene, are you there? Can you use your microphone? Myrene, do you have your microphone on, turned on? Para ho marinig ng ating mga classmates yung sagot po natin.
Hello po, sir.
Okay. Yes, Myrene. Why do you think when we speak of economic globalization, we are more on the advantage side as a country? Go ahead, please.
Um, Kasi po yung nagkakaroon po ng mas maraming opportunities for employment, gano'n po. Tapos po nag yung trade and nagge-generate din po ng mga labor para po sa mga Pilipino.
Mm-hmm.
And also, um, yung trade and
Mm-hmm.
yung yung palitan po ng products overseas po
Okay, so
is
for you, when
nakakapag-boost po yun ng economy ng Pilipinas.
at least for Myrene, when you talk about economic globalization, because of the exchanges of trades and services, it actually somehow helps in boosting the economy of the Philippines. Thank you, Myrene. Ichiro, are you there? Ichiro, how about sa'yo? Do you think it's more of an advantage, economic globalization? Thank you,
Opo,
sir.
mas advantage po siguro.
Bakit po, sir?
Kasi po nakakatulong po yung it help us get the products that we don't see in our countries po.
The country. Ikaw ba, ano yung mga products na natutuwa ka na bunga ng economic globalization na nagagamit mo na wala sa
Ano,
Pilipinas?
yung mga bagong products po, kunwari yung mga bagong labas na iPhone po na wala pa dito, ganun.
Okay, because the Philippines is not producing iPhones anyway. So ang mga iPhones na ito ay galing sa ibang bansa. Okay,
Opo,
so
ganun po.
somehow to a certain extent it is to our advantage. Thank you very much. Jude Valencia, are you there, Jude? Jude, is your microphone working? Hi, Jude. Hi, is your microphone working, Jude? Ay, hindi gumagana ang kanyang microphone. Hi, Lorenzo. Yes, please. Kindly answer. Go ahead, please.
Wait,
What's your answer? Go ahead, please.
if it's more of an advantage sa country,
Yes, sir. Bakit po?
yung
What do
economic
you think
global,
so?
yeah, it's more of an advantage because it not just brings goods and services that are otherwise not available to the country, but also brings the
Mm-hmm.
knowledge and
Okay.
the knowledge and know-how on how to utilize those so we
Mm-hmm.
could be more competitive in the world. Like for example,
Mm-hmm.
yung mga BPOs, yung mga call center, at yung
Yep.
turismo, for example.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very
For
much. Now, you
example.
actually made a very good point when you talk about the utilization of knowledge, okay, na nakukuha natin sa ibang bansa. Since when you talk about our country, definitely, this is not a first world country. So definitely, we have to take advantage of everything that we can get, okay, as a country from this. Hannah Joy, are you there? Hannah, hello. Hannah, is your microphone working? Same question, Hannah. Do you think economic globalization is more of an advantage to the Philippines? Ay, hindi gumagana. Venice, are you there? Hello? Okay, Venice? Is your microphone working, Venice?
Hi, sir.
Hi, Venice. Thank you for joining us today. You were not around last week, pero okay lang naman. Hi, Venice. Do you think economic globalization is more of an advantage sa Pilipinas?
Yes po.
Or bakit po? Go ahead, please. I'm just asking yung answers ninyo sa discussion board natin. Go ahead, please.
Um, kasi po, wait lang, sir. Medyo maano.
Yes, Venice. What do you think is the reason? Okay, if you could think of one, what do you think is the best reason why at least economic globalization is to a certain extent an advantage to our country?
Sir, because yung local and foreign companies here in the Philippines, um, they are given more chance na makipag sa larger market around the world.
Okay, so competition. At least we have the
Yes.
capacity to compete. Okay.
Opo.
Thank you very much. So at least when you talk about competition, pwede tayong sumali kahit papaano. Malcolm, hi Ace. Gumagana ang microphone mo, Ace. Hello? Ayun, nawawala si Ace. Ryan Ragoho. Ryan, is your microphone working? Ryan. Nako, nawawala si Ryan. Okay. Hi, Daniel. You're raising your hand. Go ahead,
Sa
please.
akin, sir, sagot po ako.
Go ahead.
Kasi advantage po para sa akin kasi mas mapapadali po yun nga po, yung communication, yung competition, kaya natin makipag-compete around the world. Kasi nga, di ba sabi niyo po kanina, ano na nga po tayo, tawag dito, developing country na po. So, ibig sabihin po, may progress po na nangyayari dito sa bansa natin.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Daniel, I hope you read my course message nga pala, ha? I have a course
Okay na po,
message.
sir.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
po.
Okay. Kimberly, are you there? Kimberly. Hi, Kimberly. Microphone working? Hi, Kimberly. Is your microphone working? Ay, hindi gumagana ang kanyang microphone. Okay. For most of us people, we think that economic globalization is actually beneficial to our country. But what do you think are certain not so good ramifications or uh, disadvantages of economic globalization to our country? What do you think? Anyone? Hi, Lorenzo. Go ahead. Please answer.
Parang yung mga disadvantage is one ay baka yung mga foreign firms baka maabuso yung mga Filipino workers dahil
How
kasi
do you think is it possible? How do you think it happens? The abuse of Filipino workers in economic globalization.
well alam mo naman since cheaper ang labor here so they tend to
Yeah.
put their firms here. Pero pagka they made Filipino workers might not have the similar benefits towards
True.
the foreign firm.
Very good.
And
Yes.
probably the worst is probably baka yung mga most of the province hindi pumunta pagka sa mga foreign firms lang hindi bumalik sa mga tao. I think that's what happened sa Cuba. Kaya naman
Thank you,
naging
sir.
komunista.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think ang one of the main disadvantage talaga is doon sa may labor sector natin since masyadong mura ang labor dito sa Pilipinas. So yung mga transnational companies, they come here, they put up their businesses here and they pay cheap labor, really cheap labor in the Philippines. Okay, so they go not only to our country but similarly to some Southeast Asian countries. Okay, so doon sila nagtatayo ng mga companies and they shell out little money for the labor of the people, but they get a lot from it. Okay, so I mean the ramifications are both tawag dito to a certain extent it could be an advantage, to a certain level also it could be a disadvantage, but you have to consider people na itong growth na ito makikita talaga natin particularly sa mga first world countries, and yet economic globalization remains to be an uneven process. And when we talk about yung uneven process ng economic globalization, because there doesn't seem to be it's not really benefiting everyone across the world. I mean, mostly ang nagbe-benefit pa rin ito sa kasalukuyan are first world countries. And to a certain extent, hindi pa rin makahabol yung mga developing countries katulad natin. Some countries, corporations, and individuals are benefiting a lot more, okay, than the ad when you talk about tariff reductions and lessening of trade barriers as processes often have been unfair. Okay? And more often than not, ang mga developed countries kasi are very much protectionist. They are actually protecting their own interests. Okay, when you talk about their businesses, protectionist because they actually wanted to safeguard their primary products from being overwhelmed by imports from the developing world. Say, for example, you talk about Japan's rice imports and the sugar industry in the US. Now, faced with all these protectionist measures and whatnot, poorer countries they can actually do very little, okay, to level or somehow make even on the economic playing field. That's why there are trade imbalances, and these characterize economic relations between developed and developing countries. The beneficiaries of of economic globalization have been mainly transnational corporations, okay, and not really mga nation states or yung mga governments. That's the reason why ang mga nation states, they have to keep up with the current trend of economic globalization, because they have to filter out what is not helping their country, and they have to get the most or make the most out of the advantages that their countries could get, okay, doon sa may economic globalization. And so these transnational corporations are more concerned on the profits really, okay, than assisting in the social programs of host governments. Perhaps itong special times na pinagdadaanan natin ngayon bisang bansa, you will be able to figure out kung aling mga transnational corporations are into helping yung mga social causes ng bansa natin sa kasalukuyan. Say for example, yung mga nakikita tayo ngayon ng mga multinational companies, mga transnational companies na tumutulong, okay, para tulungan yung ating mga frontliners, yung mga ating mga first responders. But definitely there are still a lot of multinational companies who are not even giving who are turning their blind eyes, okay, in helping our current situation at the moment. Now, host countries, occasionally we try to lose our tax laws for these transnational companies. That's the reason why ito'y hindi nakakatulong para tumaas yung sahod nating mga Pilipino. And you have to consider also that at least in the Philippines, we have what we call as Manila and provincial rates. This is something that hopefully na ma-abolish, kasi it's not really helping. The reason why there are a lot of Filipinos flocking in the metro is because of what we call as Manila and provincial rates, right? Ang sa akin dito, you work 8 to 10 hours a day for the same type of job. So I don't think it is fair for us to have provincial and Manila rates. Okay, but granting that this is the way it is at the moment, perhaps in the future, mapalitan itong sistemang ito. Okay, it also sacrifices social and environmental programs that protect the underprivileged, definitely. Okay, so you talk about the concept of the race to the bottom. This is a term used to at least refer to countries lowering their standard of labor, including the protection of workers' interests, to lure in foreign investors. And when you talk about the protection of workers' interests, definitely you talk about, say for example, yung tinatawag natin na sa mga kumpanya, wala silang mga tawag dito, wala silang grupo doon who are actually protecting their rights. Okay? Now, what these foreign investors actually are seeking is for their higher profits. Okay? At the lowest possible cost. Of course, when you talk about business, you always want that, but definitely not to the extent that you are trying to look at laborers as a means to your own ends, and you are not even taking care of what they should be taken care of, okay, as human beings, as people. Definitely. So, to conclude our discussion, international economic integration is a central tenet of globalization. We cannot do away with economic globalization. The economic integration definitely is always concentrating on economic integration. So crucial to this process that we mistake globalization as economic integration as a whole. Although we have to be reminded though that economics is just window into the phenomenon of globalization. Katulad po ng binanggit ko sa inyo kanina, when we speak of globalization, it's not entirely economic globalization. You have political globalization, and then you have cultural globalization, which we have to at least tawag dito, we will be discussing later on in our discussion. Nevertheless, when you talk about globalization, definitely this is anchored on economic changes. So you talk about global culture, okay, as being affected by the current system of as affected by the current system of globalization. And also, it's not only cultural globalization, but also what I told you a while ago, that when you talk about globalization, it's not just economic and cultural globalization, but we have to consider also the political globalization, which has to keep up with the current phase of economic globalization. Okay, so you have to consider also that when you talk about economic globalization, this includes the globalization of trades of goods and services. Of course, it also includes the globalization of financial capital and markets, yung globalization ng technology and the way we communicate with people in its entirety, the global production of goods and services. And that is very important in our discussion of these people. Kaya nga po, pag pinag-usapan natin ulit yung economic globalization, it has its perks, it has its advantages, it has its disadvantages. But definitely, you have to consider that the country has to keep up with the way that we are doing it. For most of you guys, sa may discussion board natin, most of us are thinking that economic globalization is actually benefiting us Filipinos. And I will not take it away from you, because definitely we are benefiting from it. But also we have to consider the protection of our laborers, if I may. Okay, lalo na sa mga panahon na ito na sobrang nahihirapan yung mga manggagawa natin na no work, no pay. Okay, ang kanilang kinasasadlakan sa kasalukuyan. And perhaps some of our families are affected by such as well. Okay, so this will wrap up our discussion on economic globalization. Any questions so far? May mga tanong po ba tayo? Hello?
Wala naman po.
Wala naman po tayong mga tanong-tanong dito po. Now, it is important that economic globalization be made more just, okay, so that it benefits everyone. Okay, doon sa may part na yon. Okay, pag sinabi natin it has to be just, definitely, siguro we talk about yung pagtaas ng sahod, pagtanggal ng mga regional wage, yung comparison ng Metro Manila wage, yung provincial rate natin. Ito yung isang bagay na hindi natin kinatutuwaan, definitely, when we consider such. So this is our topic today, the structures of globalization. Still, we are on the course SS33, the contemporary